Okay. Well, I'm not sure if we'll cover quite everything today, but I'm going to try because on Friday we need to cover the German and Hungarian and European revolutions, which follow in the wake of the Russian one. But this material is extremely important, and it keeps striking me at almost every stage of the lecture today just how daunting and frightening the parallels are with really all revolutions, including ones which are breaking out right now. To wit, if you look at the tactics, people, of course, celebrating one day, we have democracy. Well, and it's true. In the Kerensky period, Russia was probably freer than it had ever been before, and until it would be again until the 1990s under Yeltsin, which then, of course, was followed by the Putin period, the suppression of the free press and so on. Well, in 1917, the freedom of the press, which was just emerging in that summer, that chaotic summer, of course would be clamped down on almost immediately by the Bolsheviks, along with freedom of assembly and freedom of just about everything else. There's pretty much no freedom left by the time the Bolsheviks were firmly entrenched in power. But how did they actually achieve power? Now, I made it sound kind of easy. They fanned out across the city. They took all the key choke points, bridges, power stations, the post office, communications nodal points. It was really the kind of the classic example of a cynical modern coup d'etat. They had, however, prepared the way, somewhat cynically, but also, to some extent, I think, legitimately, with their political sloganeering. The most famous slogan, which I should have written but didn't, which you've probably heard, is peace, land, and bread. Now, the Bolsheviks were about as sincere in promising people peace, land, and bread as I would be if I promised you peace on earth and a chicken in every pot. And I mean, it's just one of those slogans which was cynical. On the other hand, it was also ingenious in a way. Peace meant, very simply, we will end the war. Land meant, well, all of you peasants who feel like you should have land can have it, probably. Bread meant, well, yeah, there are bread rights, we'll make sure you have enough bread. This was probably the weakest of the three because, of course, communism produced in Russia, as in China, as in Cambodia, as in Cuba, basically everywhere communism has been tried, it produces famines and starvation. So bread was definitely not a big priority, but it sounded good. Now, there was another slogan you might have heard, all power to the Soviets. This is the slogan under which theoretically the Bolsheviks seized power. Now, they started using this slogan round about September 1917 after they had achieved majority control of the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, which is to say, if they didn't control them, they didn't want them to have power. Once they controlled them, they said all power to the Soviets. Now, they were increasingly in charge of those Soviets. Again, I said it was not all cynical. A lot of things were moving their way. Exhaustion with the war, the general sentiment that it all had to end. All of this was kind of moving in the Bolsheviks' direction. The SRs, the party of Kerensky, the Mensheviks, who were trying to work with Kerensky on many issues, they were sort of caught out. They could not simply oppose the war. So yes, the Bolsheviks did start to win influence in the Soviets. When they said all power to the Soviets, though, it really was just a slogan. When they fanned out over Petrograd and seized power, in practical fact, they said in political terms that they were seizing power on behalf of the Soviets. But that was not true. The actual organization which organized the coup was called the Military Revolutionary Committee, or Milrevkom. They abbreviate everything, the Bolsheviks. It makes things easier, but it's also kind of obnoxious. Eventually, they set up a committee to legitimize the coup d'etat, which will become something like the executive, the so-called Council or Soviet of People's Commissars, Sovnarkom, as it was kind of Russified and shortened, which they controlled. Again, in theory, they are doing this on behalf of the worker Soviets. They have seized power in the name of the workers. In practical fact, that was very far from being true. In fact, the power seizure, even in Petrograd, was regarded almost immediately as illegitimate by huge sections of the population. We know this not least because the very first 2 months the Bolsheviks were in power, they devoted their primary energies to strike breaking because no one wanted to work for them. You remember how I talked about Trotsky? Trotsky goes to the foreign commissariat and he says, I am your new foreign minister. Everyone just kind of laughs. They show up at the banks and they say, we must make withdrawals on behalf of people's government. And the bank employees said, not going to happen. No. They literally then went to the banks, you know, with a bunch of thugs carrying guns, and they tried to rob the banks. And they actually failed because the bank employees didn't break ranks. The money was all in the vaults, and they didn't tell them where the keys were. I kid you not. Eventually, they got the keys. And they brought the keys back to Lenin, and they took this little like chamois bag, and they said, Lenin, here are keys to bank vaults of National Bank and this bank and that bank. Here are keys. And Lenin said, keys? You give me keys? We want the money. And so then they went back to the banks, and they still couldn't get the money. This is all true. They actually then took hostages. And of the 5 hostages that they took from each bank, they demanded, supposedly the story went, 1 million rubles per head, but cash down only. And they got 5 million rubles. And that was it. That's all the banks gave them. The bank strike is one of the key events of the Russian Revolution, although it is glossed over in most of the histories. It lasted for 6 months. The Bolsheviks could not make withdrawals. The only money they had was from party dues and whatever money the Germans were able to smuggle in. And the Germans actually were not smuggling it as much as they did before because they thought they had already kind of achieved their objective, which in fact they had. The very first thing Lenin did upon seizing power was to send an unencrypted message en clair to the German general staff offering an immediate ceasefire, which was granted, of course. The Bolsheviks then began dissolving the army. It didn't look good. They're dissolving the army, they're surrendering to the Germans, they've seized power on behalf of the workers, but the workers aren't working for them. First it was the bank workers, then eventually the municipal workers, sanitation, garbage and things like that. Pretty soon, no one was working. It was like a general strike against the workers' government. It's important to remember this because it was in order to break the public employee strike that the Bolsheviks founded the Cheka, the organization that will later evolve into famously GPU, NKVD, eventually, of course, KGB or KGB, or as we know it today, the FSB. The actual term, one of these acronyms, was short for the Чрезвычайная комиссия по борьбе с контрреволюцией и саботажем. Now, I'm going to circle this last word because this is the key. Sabotagem. Sabotage. What this meant was that the banks were not giving them money. That was the sabotage they were referring to. The workers' government was being sabotaged by the evil bourgeois employees of the banks who were not giving the Bolsheviks money. And so that's why they set up the Cheka. They then started publishing all of these decrees, nationalizing the banks, etc., etc. But remember, the bank strike is still going on. So here's what they did instead. They couldn't get into the vaults. So what they said instead was, we will call out every day a letter of the alphabet, beginning with A, and all people whose name begins with this letter, it sounds like it's like in a Woody Allen movie. All people whose letter begins with A, name begins with A, must show up to the bank with the key to your safety deposit box. Or we will do what we're going to do anyway, which is to take everything in your safety deposit box. You were supposed to show up and rob yourself. It was literally what they ordered people to do. Now, as you might expect, not everyone did this. A lot of people realized they were living in a lunatic asylum, and so they decided to, leave the country. As late as, I think, 1921, they were still trying to go through the safe deposit boxes. They'd only gotten into about 20,000 of them. They eventually had a whole government department devoted to safe cracking. I kid you not, to breaking open safes by force, because people were not all bringing their keys. So they got some money from this. They actually published this in the papers. They said in Pravda, in the official paper, they said, thus far, the campaign to expropriate the expropriators has yielded, 53 million rubles in paper, some government bonds, and this much gold. That's what they called it. They were robbing people. But remember, that's what communism was. That's what it meant to expropriate the expropriators. That's what it meant to abolish private property. They actually had a propaganda campaign to explain all this. And they set it up in the form of an allegory. You know, like a young, sort of an idealist who wants to do the right thing is talking to an old Bolshevik. And, he looks at the old Bolshevik and he says, "Sir, is it true that you rob and you loot?" You rob. And he says, "Yes, we loot the looters." That is, мы грабим награбленное. This is, after all, the theory of Marxist capital accumulation. It has all been stolen from the workers, and so now they're just stealing it back. So that's what they did. They tried to steal back everything from the capitalists. They gave the capitalists a chance to turn it over voluntarily, and if not, then they would just, seize it by force. But still, the bank strike goes on. So the Bolsheviks are pretty weak. The Germans aren't sending them a lot of money. People aren't cooperating and robbing themselves. They're not really much of a government yet. In fact, they're not a real government until March of 1918. A couple of things happen in March, the two key events. One is that on the 4th of March, the Bolsheviks signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. I think I did talk about Trotsky the other day. Did I talk about no war, no peace? No war, no peace? This is just brilliant. Okay, no war, no peace. This was his position at the negotiations. We will not fight you, but we will not fight you. We will not wage war, and we will not ask for peace. We will dissolve our army, but we will not surrender. This is actually what he said. The German who's listening to this, General Hoffmann, he says, "Unerhört! This is unheard of. It makes no sense." It's interesting that after listening to one of Trotsky's speeches, this American is one of my favorite quotes on Trotsky. Colonel Raymond Robbins, he was talking about how the German general staff had supposedly bought Trotsky, and he said, if that was true, they bought a lemon. Like a lemon, a car that doesn't run. But an even better quote was after one of Trotsky's better speeches. He said, "My word, that man, Trotsky, is a four-kind son of a bitch, but the greatest Jew since Jesus." But it was kind of ingenious in a way. Because after all, the Germans now have to explain to their people why they're fighting a country that doesn't have an army, right? And there's anti-war sentiment in Germany too. That's sort of the Bolsheviks' idea, right? They want to just end the war everywhere. So they're saying, look, we will not fight. We dissolve army. We will not surrender. Now the Germans have to explain to their people why they're fighting Russia, a country that doesn't have an army. Now, of course, the Germans weren't all that squeamish about it. They just went ahead and started occupying Russia. They took the Ukraine. They already had Poland. They moved right up through the Baltic states, and they took, what is now Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but they actually started bombing Petrograd because Trotsky was being so obnoxious. It was because the Germans were actually bombing Petrograd in March that the Bolsheviks famously moved the capital from there to Moscow. Not completely unlike what Ataturk did with moving it to Ankara, basically to be out of range of the guns. It was like to get out of the range of the Germans. And so the Germans, they just, by this point, they had it with Trotsky and the Bolsheviks. Yeah, they were sort of German puppets, but they're also really annoying, And so finally Lenin signed the peace treaty, which essentially gave up all of European Russia. The Germans theoretically were running it through satellite states, but basically the Germans got Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, which is to say most of Russian industry, most of Russian iron, most of Russian coal, the vast Russian wheat production, grain industry was all now in German hands. The Turks, of course, pushed on and eventually took Baku after retaking all the lands they had lost to the Russians. So this treaty worked out pretty well for the other side. It was, shall we say, treasonous to Russia to sign this treaty. In fact, that's what the social revolutionaries said to Lenin. They actually shouted him out. Lenin had to leave the chamber in disgrace when he was addressing the Council of People's Commissars. the left SRs, they all screamed at him, "Down with the traitor!" They wanted to hang him because he had signed this treaty. Remember, the Bolsheviks are not very strong yet. They don't have a lot of money. Then something magical happens. Towards the end of March, they cut a deal with the banks. Basically, they said, okay, we wanted to kill you all, but we will allow you to live, and we'll even allow like 2/3 of you to keep your jobs. It was a compromise. They fired about 2,000 people. They let 4,000 continue working. In exchange for their lives, the bank employees agreed finally to open up the vaults. So the Bolsheviks now had money. They had signed a treaty with the Germans, and they have money, which meant what they could do, and the very first thing they did is they kicked all of the last left SRs out of the government. Oh, I forgot to mention the other part. The Bolsheviks, bizarrely, and again, because they were still weak, they could do nothing about the fact that elections had been scheduled, and the elections were actually held. This, incidentally, I don't know what's going to happen in Egypt, but this parallels, interestingly, what happened in Germany. You know, even after the Nazis had taken power, they actually held elections when the Nazis actually controlled the government. And the Nazis, they did well, but they only got 43%. You know, they didn't even get 50%. The Bolsheviks, who had theoretically seized power, got about 20% in the elections. The SRs got a vast majority. The SRs had, you know, more than 400 out of 700 seats. So the SRs were clearly the party that should have been in power. The reason they weren't in power, of course, is that when the assembly convened, I forgot to mention that part. Okay, so 8 January, if you want the date, 8 January 1918, the Constituent Assembly convenes in Petrograd. The Bolsheviks try to take it over. They fail. You know, that is through like parliamentary procedures. And so the Bolsheviks send a bunch of thugs with machine guns. They surround the parliament, and they arrest everybody. They just dissolve the parliament, just like that. A popularly elected government. And then, once they have the money, this is a couple months later in April, they also kick the last remaining opposition forces, the left SRs, who had helped them achieve power the previous fall. Now, they shot them in the back. They kicked them all out of the government. This was in April 1918. So, by April 1918, for the first time, you can say they're in power. They don't control the whole country yet, but they control Moscow, they control Petrograd. There's opposition, yes, but the Bolsheviks have a monopoly on armed force in the cities. They don't have an army. There is no army anymore. Russia had mobilized an army of 5, 6, 7 million people in the war. There's no more army. The Bolsheviks, in fact, rely on a kind of Praetorian Guard. There were the so-called Red Guards, but there weren't very many of those. The actual strike force, the battalions, they were a bunch of Latvians, or Lets as they were called. In fact, if you talk to Russian patriots and whites, they absolutely hate Latvians because they blame them for the Russian Revolution. It was like a kind of almost a personal bodyguard, for Lenin and the Bolsheviks. They cut some deal, obviously, where they got in on the money. So the Bolsheviks have a force of like 35,000, Latvians. When I say the Bolsheviks didn't have an army, I'm not joking. There was a detachment of prisoners of war, Czechs and Slovaks, who had been captured like 2 or 3 years ago. They were being held in Siberia. And the Allies, the French and English, wanted them to come fight in the Western Front. So they were going down the Trans-Siberian Railway, this is in the summer of 1918, on their way to Vladivostok. A very long way of getting back to the Western Front. Anyway, they ran into some Hungarians. Now, the Hungarians were also prisoners of war. Now, as you might know, Czechs and Hungarians don't really like each other very much. They don't hate each other quite as much as Romanians and Hungarians. But anyway, they started scuffling. They had a fight. Then the Czechs took over the railway. And then they took over Siberia. A detachment of 30,000 Czechoslovak prisoners of war ruled Siberia in 1918. They actually captured the gold reserve. And eventually they used the gold reserve, once the Red Army had kind of emerged, to buy free passage. They actually took over Siberia. The Bolsheviks just control a couple of cities. The Czechs control Siberia. Meanwhile, the French and the English, and even later the Americans, have landed troops in Russia. Now, the Soviets told everyone for years that this proved there was a capitalist conspiracy against them. A fact which made this difficult to swallow is that they were actually invited into the country by Trotsky. Because the Germans, remember, the Germans are also occupying the country. So you've got 1 million Germans occupying the country. This is all in 1918. 1 million Germans occupying the country. Czechoslovak prisoners of war control Siberia. There are small detachments of like French and English troops. Americans arrive a little bit later. The Bolsheviks are theoretically in power. The fact that they were not really that powerful yet, though, is attested by the interesting fact that the SRs, remember them, they've been expelled from power now, to protest Lenin's emerging dictatorship, as they saw it. They assassinated Count Mirbach, who was the German ambassador. In other words, the German ambassador was, in a sense, the real sovereign of the country in 1918. The Bolsheviks were tools of the Germans. They were tools because they were seen as useful in destroying the country so that Germany could take it over. This, in a way, this is one of the really interesting facets of the diplomatic history of the First World War. I think, and this is not a popular argument with my fellow Americans, but I think that America's entry into the war essentially made the world safe, not for democracy, but for communism. And that is because by defeating the Germans, the Americans allowed the Bolsheviks to become a real government. They weren't really a government until the Germans finally left. The Germans had 1 million troops in Russia. The Bolsheviks had a bodyguard of about 35,000. They didn't have an army yet. So basically what happens is when the Germans are finally again defeated in the First World War, which happens in like August, September 1918, this allows the Bolsheviks to finally begin coming into their own. It's only in the fall of 1918 that they begin organizing an army, that they begin acting like a sovereign government. In fact, I think literally the act, you might call it like the act of independence. You know, America had its tea party, you know, where they took the British tea and they dumped it in the water. What the Bolsheviks had was the screw the Germans day. What they did was they literally, you remember like how they had tried to rob the banks and everything? They literally went to the German consulates in Moscow and Petersburg. They arrested everyone and they stole all the money. That's literally what they did. They did this in October 1918, thus becoming, in effect, an independent government. So the fall of 1918 is what really marks, I think, the real seizure of power. The October Revolution, you know, Red October as it was glorified, that was, yeah, it was dramatic, but it took them a year before they were really in any kind of serious sovereign position. A year when they were experimenting, trying desperately to get money, getting rid of their enemies like the left SRs, basically preparing the way for the real days of power. In fact, I'm not sure they were entirely sure they would have emerged with power. They were laundering money in Stockholm and Switzerland. I don't think they thought they would last. I think Germany's loss actually shocked them. In fact, right up to Germany surrendering in the war and the Bolsheviks deciding to sack the German consulates, the Bolsheviks were actually sending gold to Germany by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. There's a saga where the Czech government, and actually the Romanian government, even more than the Czechs, Romanian government is still trying to find out what happened to its gold reserve, which it sent to Russia in 1916 for safekeeping, and they never got it back. I think what actually happened is that the Bolsheviks sent it to Germany. And then the Germans, you know, sent it on to Paris, and then it eventually disappeared. But so, okay, so end of 1918, the World War is finally over. You know, the armistice is signed. The Bolsheviks are now in power, and they have to figure out what to do with it. One hint of what they were going to do had already transpired. There were a lot of assassinations in this day and age, as you can imagine. The key assassination was of a man called Moisey Uritsky. You don't need to remember his name. What you need to remember is that he was the head of the Cheka, or the secret police. Until this point, the Cheka, they were not nice guys. But they weren't that numerous yet. They weren't arresting that many people yet. They weren't killing that many people yet. Because the Bolsheviks were weak. They weren't sure of themselves. They weren't a real government yet. The assassination of the chief of the Cheka unleashed the floodgates. Within 6 months after this, they had arrested and executed without trial about 1,000 people. This is what we refer to as, it's over here, the Red Terror. A couple things to remember about the Red Terror to distinguish it from, let's say the terror in the French Revolution or later on the Great Terror under Stalin, is that it was waged against what were called class enemies. It didn't matter what you did, it mattered who you were. That is, there were categories of people who were singled out. Capitalists, obviously, property owners, obviously, but also things like school teachers. I don't know why, but they really didn't like school teachers. Prostitutes. I don't know why. You think they might like prostitutes, but no, they didn't. They saw prostitutes as capitalists, and so they listed them in like these decrees. Money lenders, that one's kind of not surprising. Speculators, profiteers, hyenas, whole categories of people. They are essentially determined to be exterminated. And it doesn't matter what they do. It's who they are. Now, admittedly, some of these people had figured out that their lives were in danger, and so they just went to work for the government. The Bolsheviks eventually figured out that because they didn't know how anything worked, they actually had to hire a lot of experts who knew about things like engineering and banking and so on. And so very rapidly a procedure developed whereby you could sort of save your life by going to work for the government. But people who didn't do that, their lives were in danger. So the Red Terror is unleashed, class war, class enemies, no trials. They arrest you and they decide whether or not you live or die. So this begins. It just begins in 1918. It doesn't really get going until the Civil War is kind of in sway. But meanwhile, they also, because the opposition against them is becoming organized, the whites, mostly led by kind of czarist generals, who saw the Bolsheviks as traitors because they had surrendered to Germany and so on. The whites begin organizing an army. Denikin in the south, Kolchak in Siberia, Yudenich, incidentally, was the commander on the Caucasian front against the Turks. And he leads the white resistance in the Baltics against Petrograd. So they're beginning to form this opposition. France and Britain have decided they're going to support the whites, and so you get the outlines of what will become a vicious civil war. The Civil War, usually dated from about 1918 to 1920, starts loosely in the fall of 1918. Most of the battles were over by the end of 1919, although the whites regrouped for a while in 1920. That was the Civil War proper. Now, as a kind of justification for what they were doing, it was actually ideal. Because it looked like, again, the capitalists of the world are teaming up. Just like if you remember in the French Revolution with the terror, the idea was there were spies everywhere because there's a war on. This serves as the ideal foil for the Red Terror. Spies, counter-revolutionaries, capitalists, profiteers, tools of the whites, all kinds of categories of people are now singled out for extermination. Now, the whites were, of course, no angels either. Their own particular sin was anti-Semitism. They organized a lot of pogroms against Jews, particularly in Ukraine. It was not anywhere near as simple as the Jews against everyone else, but it is definitely true there was a major component, especially in the Cheka, of Jews who were kind of settling scores, because they had been persecuted in Tsarist times. And the whites, conversely, blamed the revolution on Jews. Trotsky famously was Jewish, along with Kamenev and a lot of other Bolsheviks, although Lenin was not Jewish. So there's an element of this. The war gets really nasty. There's this man you might have heard of, the Mad Baron of Mongolia, Baron Ungarn Sternberg. He was actually a sort of Germanic descent, but he was a white general who defected, and a little bit like Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. He sets up this crazy empire where all kinds of horrendous atrocities are being committed. The Reds ultimately killed a lot more people than the whites, but the whites were no angels either. Now, the Bolsheviks, again, they're getting more and more radical. Some of their ideas were probably there to begin with, but the war gives them justification. Eventually, they came up with a term in retrospect to describe their policies during this era, a period I'm going to date for you, 1918 to 21. They called it war communism. The idea being, the war was on, and so this made us be as radical as possible. They used this later on when they were trying to talk about their new, more moderate policy. At the time, though, it was just what they did. But here's what it meant, aside from the Cheka, class enemies, all the rest of it. They not only nationalized all industries and banks, which again meant that they sort of robbed them, whole categories of people. They literally abolished all private trade, all buying and selling, and money. It wasn't just that you weren't allowed to have like a watch or a cell phone or jewelry. You literally could not have money. They destroyed the moneyed economy in Russia. I cannot emphasize enough how amazing this is. Money, which goes back thousands of years, they literally destroyed it as an institution. They abolished it. Everything was done through barter. Ration cards, who you knew in the government. Whether you starved, whether you lived or died, was now up to the government. Now, the government, of course, had to do business as you would expect. And here's where things got kind of bizarre, because they needed to buy all of this stuff, like weapons and bullets and ammunition and uniforms. And so what they did is they would create special licenses for Cheka agents, saying this person is allowed to carry money. But anyone else caught carrying money could be executed, just like that, because you were a capitalist hyena, or whatever term they wanted to use. They literally abolished money. Now, even Stalin never did that. It's interesting, because Stalin, in the supposedly most radical phase of collectivization in the 1930s, did not abolish money. Lenin did. Lenin, in many ways, was even more radical, even more ruthless, even more bloodthirsty than Stalin. Now, I think the most sinister and interesting aspect of this period, it's something that wasn't understood until recently because it wasn't as well documented. It's all happening kind of at the same time. It's all related, but it's not quite the same. I'm going to use this term, peasant wars. Now, loosely speaking, the issue was this. Same issue the Tsarist government had had that led to the February Revolution. In some ways, what had helped kind of Kerensky fall from power. Basically, not enough food was getting to the cities. First, it was because of inflation. Now, that was, of course, even worse under the Bolsheviks. I mean, the Bolsheviks, before they abolished money, what's funny was like the last days of the Tsar, they started printing money like faster and faster. In the early days of communism, before they abolished money, they literally wouldn't even print on both sides of the page. they just stamp one side, go on to the next. So you have hyperinflation. So that's part of it. But then you also have the fact that the Bolsheviks have forbidden buying and selling. So how are you going to get food? Well, obviously there was a black market. If there weren't a black market, that is an unofficial, illegal underground economy, everyone would have starved. Now, to some extent, the Bolsheviks must have winked the other way at times. They called them bagmen, in fact. They had a term for this. I mean, it was literally like you were carrying food in bags, in from the countryside to the cities. Why would you do this? Well, it's true that money was now worthless, but there were other things than money. You remember how it was illegal to have money or gold, also illegal to have jewelry. So if you had this stuff, you wanted to get rid of it. And you also wanted to eat. And so you would use it to buy grain. In fact, there's this one statistic that always stood out for me. One of these countesses, like a highborn aristocrat, who was just trying to survive, she said that eventually it got to the point where like a 4-carat diamond ring was not enough to get you bread. You needed a brooch like this big to get a bag of flour. Like diamond brooch like this big, which in today's economy would net you like $50 million probably. You needed that for like a bag of bread. Because they literally abolished the moneyed economy, as I have said. Now, this didn't help bring grain to the cities, as you can imagine. Yes, there were some brave peasants willing to go into the black market to get, jewelry and profiteer and so on. But there was no proper market now for produce. So what the Bolsheviks did, they literally set up these things. They called them, and I kid you not, food armies. And they went out into the countryside, and they just kind of stole food from everybody. And eventually this led to, as you can expect, a kind of civil war inside the Civil War. Now, I said these things were not all the same. When the enemies were whites and foreigners, then some of the peasants did, join the Red Army, and they helped the Bolsheviks, in part because they might have been patriots, or maybe they didn't want the Tsar to come back. It was really the end of this war, that is, the expulsion of the whites, evacuated. Most of the men ended up in Istanbul, of course, starting cabarets. Regence, I think, is still there. I don't know if anyone has been to Regence off the Istiklal Caddesi. Yeah, that's like the last remnant of the white Russian immigration. So when the whites leave and it's like the foreigners have been expelled, in a way that was when the real war began, because now the peasants turned on the government. So it was the Bolsheviks against the peasants. Now the Bolsheviks had a couple of advantages. They had inherited all the gold reserves, they had robbed the banks, they had hoarded humongous quantities of things like platinum. And they used this to buy artillery, shell, machine guns, and all the rest of it. All the peasants had were, pitchforks, farm implements. So the peasant wars were between a ruthless army, heavily armed, that is the government, the Bolsheviks, the state, against the peasants. Now the Bolsheviks won, as you might imagine. The casualty figure, though, is interesting. The Red Army lost 238,000 men fighting against unarmed peasants. It gives you just an idea of the scale of this war, which, again, was not even really known about until recently because there weren't any documents about it. We knew about like little bits and pieces of it. We knew about a couple of episodes. One I'll mention, I know I'm running out of time, but it's a key landmark in kind of like the history of politics in Europe, particularly on the left. If you've ever met like a real live Trotskyist, or any of you Trotskyists, go ahead, raise your hand, you don't have to be shy. Now Trotskyists are fun because they know their facts. They know about Kronstadt. Kronstadt was an island, off the coast of Petrograd, where the Bolsheviks initially were very popular. They got a lot of their support there. The sailors were very radical. They mutinied. They supported the Bolsheviks. That was back in 1917. In March of 1921, they rose against the Bolsheviks because they said, look, this is not what we signed on for. We thought we were getting, workers, government, democracy, etc. Instead, we get the secret police and commissarocracy and firing squads and a lot of dead people. And we're not real happy about it. So they rose up against the Bolsheviks. Trotsky, by this point, is the commissar of the Red Army. He travels around in his famous train car outfitted with various luxuries. He was really into dining on the Tsar's former porcelain dishes and so on. Well, Trotsky, anyway, decides to organize the counter-resistance. He has all of the men's wives and children rounded up and held hostage and then shot. He has every single one of the mutineers executed. Trotsky was not a nice man. So this becomes a kind of liminal moment. It's curious that in a way it also marked the eventual moderation of the regime. It doesn't sound like it does. But there were a couple of things happening. One is that the Bolsheviks were basically saying, we're not going back. There's no going back. We're in power now, and we don't care about the pretense anymore. This wasn't even hidden. Everyone knew about it in Europe. Socialists, when they wanted to taunt communists, would always say, Kronstadt, just to remind them, you shot the workers. The other thing which happens, though, at the same time, it's related. It's not exactly the same. The Bolsheviks finally realize, it's like in the midst of this peasant war that they're fighting, that pretty much the whole country is starving. I mean, literally, they even eventually had to admit it in Pravda, the official propaganda organ, that 25 million people were on the brink of starvation. Now, it's not that they particularly cared about most of the peasants, but they realized that not everyone could starve or else there wouldn't be anything left to govern. And so they announced a new policy. NEP, short for the New Economic Policy. Nova Ekonomiczna Polityka. All this basically meant, I can summarize it very briefly. After 3 years of trying out communism, they said, we give up. They re-legalized everything. They re-legalized money. They re-legalized the grain trade. They re-legalized manufactures, private trade, real estate, everything. They said, we tried it, didn't work. We will now lick our wounds and wait for the next opportunity. Which sounds really nice and moderate, but of course, what it also meant was that they were also going to kill all of their enemies in no fewer numbers than before. But now they were going to at least allow people to buy and sell so that there would be goods in the markets and the stores again, and so that not everyone would die. So war communism eventually gives way to the new economic policy, which curiously enough was denounced by most socialists and communists in Europe as a betrayal of Marxism, which of course it was. It was a repudiation of Marxism in both the spirit and the letter. So, just the key nodal points of the second half of the lecture. Russian Civil War, war communism, again, eventually leading to the new economic policy. The only thing I didn't mention was the Volga famine, but I'll talk about that on Friday. Okay? I hope I didn't run too far over.